We are piggybacking on a point that will be talked about in our video on how to get into a Mythic Raiding Guild, or what do you need to start Mythic Raiding, which is one of the points that many players are often wondering about or curious about or simply don't quite understand, which is the question often asked about, how much does the Mythic Plus score matter when you are raiding, for example, or why, for example, do Mythic Raids seem to not care about your Mythic Plus score? On the surface, it is a quite good thing to have, of course, especially when players are, trying to sell themselves to a guild and look at what they have and they realize they are missing quite a few things for joining the guild at a level they might want to be at. They're like, well, I don't have a lot of past raiding experience, maybe even I don't even have any past raiding experience, or in this current tier I don't even have a Mythic raiding experience, but I have 3522 Mythic Plus rating. So at the very least, with this ranking in Mythic Plus, I can apply to guilds showing that I can play my character. However, very often this isn't really taken too much into account by the recruiters, the raid leaders looking through at your application. Well, there are a couple of things that go this way. The most important thing when recruiting, pretty much at almost all levels, then of course other things come into play, but it is, does this player consistently achieve cutting edge every tier? And then at higher levels it will be, has this player consistently achieved this level of rank every tier? So has it been consistent in the level of play in the raid? In lower tier guilds like rank 1000 and plus, the biggest enemy is going to be the roster boss. And in higher tier guilds like below rank 200 and so, it will be the focus and the consistency of being able to pull a boss 1 or even 200 plus times before the boss is defeated. So as an appliant, as a trial, having a track record of consistency, of sticking out on a tier, for example, with the same guild multiple times, without taking long breaks, of being burned out or being bored and quitting, are very valuable for recruiters. And obviously this doesn't really show up when it comes to having a high Mythic Plus rating. It's got nothing to do with being consistent and showing up on the same raid nights, for example, because you can push whenever you want. It has nothing to do with being loyal with the same group of players over multiple tiers when it comes to pushing Mythic Plus. So not a lot of the qualities of a good Mythic Plus players are going to translate to being a good raider. Then there is of course the stigma, there is the stereotype, the fact that if you are a Mythic Plus pusher, then by default everyone will consider you more interested in pushing Mythic Plus than pushing Mythic progression. And that's when players have bad experiences. It will translate to bad attitudes towards, for example, gearing decisions, or bad attitudes of Mythic Plus players towards research and preparation outside of the raid. Why? Because it's push week and they were busy pushing rather than looking at a couple of hours worth of logs on understanding how to fight this boss. And then more bad memories of Mythic Plus pushers getting into guild, getting to kill the boss, looting the tank trinket they needed to push Mythic Plus, and then leave. When it's time to farm, for example, when it's time to play basically in the off-season, is where they get more flaky. They start missing out on raid nights, having a worse attitude, until sometimes, very often, they just eventually leave. So very often many raiders have grown to have sort of like a bad memory of having very good, even very good Mythic Plus players in their guilds. Even though the qualities of a Mythic Plus players can still be valuable, of course. You can definitely prove that you have hands and you have eyes to play in Mythic Plus, and nobody is trying to get down the mud fight of is Mythic Plus easier or harder than Mythic Raiding, or rather, at what level can we start comparing, a world first plus 21 in Mythic Plus to a difficulty of a Mythic boss. That's not much about that part. The part that, for example, recruiters and raid leaders will be looking for is your reliability over a longer period, the consistency over that longer period, your experience your prior experience in previous guilds, showing that you already proven to have that already in previous tiers, your social skills as well. Having to manage being around other 20 to 25 people is much more different than having to be around 4 other guys in a Mythic Plus key. Other very important things in the raid are not as relevant in Mythic Plus, because in Mythic Plus you don't really get to show how well you can adapt to fights, because in Mythic Plus you have 8 dungeons to rotate, all of the dungeons will be the exact same from the moment you start them to the moment you are 4 months into the season, and they will simply get harder bit by bit, level by level, plus 19 to plus 20 to plus 21 over time. Whereas in Mythic Raiding, you have to get into a new boss, you haven't progressed yet, and then dump 100 wipes on that boss. And then you move forward, there's a new boss, now it's 200 wipes just on that boss, over and over again. And also you cannot learn, you can't adapt to that fight as easily as you can to Mythic Plus, because in Mythic Plus you can just spam the key. For you to get adapted to the patterns of damage of Priory, you can just spam Priory until you learn it. In Mythic Raiding, you're gonna be limited by raid times, by the times your guild will actually be fighting the boss, and then you're done until you get to fight it again. Also, while being the two highest level of PvE activity in the game and also requiring quite a lot of skill in both, a lot of the qualities don't transfer nearly as well if you're a very good Mythic Plus player. For example, having to learn the damage pattern in Mythic Plus. For example, having to cycle interrupts and having to cycle CC in a Mythic Plus key is almost completely irrelevant in the raid. In the raid, whenever you have the few fights where you do have adds, you will have a note, you will have an order, you will have a list of who starts the interrupt first and then second and then third. It will be scripted, the fight will always be the same, and it will always play out that way. So your skills in managing crowd controls and interrupts in Mythic Plus doesn't really have, a counterpart in the raid. Another one is damage, because after all, if you think about it, a good 70+% of your Mythic Plus key, many players will say, well, at least if I have a high Mythic Plus score, I can play my class, I know how to press my buttons. Sure, but something like 70% of your Mythic Plus key, what you're actually pressing is a 15 to 20 seconds AoE opener. You're not actually fighting a 7-minute long boss, a 7-minute long single target boss. You are fighting multiple waves of 7 to 8 mobs that you are engaging with AoE openers, while you are weaving in interrupts and crowd control, which is going to be quite different than what you are going to be doing in the raid. Also, when it comes to the difference between Mythic Plus and the raid, mechanics in the raid are much more about the entire group and much more about wide, large group encompassing mechanics, and very often also about the whole dodge thing, right? We have talked about this, for example, when we were talking about the add-on problem in the game, Blizzard having to go for things like lines, beams, swirlies in the raid, because they were one of the few mechanics that we Koras could not solve. So in Mythic Plus, you don't really have to deal with these kind of mechanics that often. Think about like Ipa, the beer boss in Midori that has the swirlies on the ground. It's just about the biggest thing you have to dodge right now in Mythic Plus. Or the swirly hammers on the second boss of Priory. But this is much different, of course, than you going into Mythic Ansorek as a Mythic Plus player and having to dodge the web blades as a melee player. Another thing from anecdotal experience also is that when you go into Mythic Plus, you're gonna be much less likely to have to work outside of the game as much as you would when you're gonna be raiding. A lot of thought will be put definitely by some players in how to go through the good routes in Mythic Plus, for example. That's a thing that some players will have to do. But for the majority of the others, though, they will simply import that route and then jump into Mythic Plus. There won't be any VOD study of a higher priority key that you can look for about 3 hours so that you can learn how to play in that key as your class. That's not what most players will do. Meanwhile, if you jump from Mythic Plus to the raid, that is kind of what you're expected to do. If you think, for example, that having a title level Mythic Plus score is the equivalent of being in a good Hall of Fame guild like rank 100 in the world, at that level, if you're about to fight Magzi, you're expected to watch 2 to 3 to 4 different VOD POVs of your same spec, your same class. Check out the Warcraft logs, check out the logs of those same specs as you to see when they are spreading their CDs, when they are going for their damage windows, when they are using their defensives, what are the most deadly phases of the fight, to check out how you can survive. Sometimes it can be extremely important when it comes to remembering the movement, for example, the dance, practicing of Sprocket, or last tier, the dance, the coordinated dance you had to do for Silken Court. if you are in a good guild and you have been raiding for a while, you will have ingrained in you the culture of looking up logs, looking up VODs, and trying to learn the fight before you're even in it. If you're a Mythic Plus player and you're not used to these kind of things, this will not come normal to you. It is not really a skill that translates from Mythic Plus to the raid. See, that is why very often you see these kind of posts, these kind of messages of some confused Mythic Plus players with 3.4k rating, wondering why they weren't accepted to this guild, or the recruiter said they weren't going to be a match because they didn't have enough raid experience, and they were wondering, but I have 3.4k rating in Mythic Plus, shouldn't this be enough to prove I am good? It is mostly just the combination of these things. The expectation of playing in a Mythic Raiding Guild being much different than the ones pushing Mythic Plus keys, both from the perspective of the commitment, the consistency, the reliability of showing up 2, 3, 4, even 5 nights a week for Mythic progression and being used to the lovely times of having to wipe 240 times to the same boss that are not really translated through if you are a Mythic Plus player who is not used to these things, as well as the different skills that you have learned in Mythic Plus that will be, of course, very good for that activity, like, for example, the rotation of interrupts, of crowd control, the managing of 10 different nameplates on your screen, which doesn't really have much of any value when you move over into Mythic Raiding, unless you're fighting like Brute Twister or something. And then the last part, unfortunately for many players, will be the stereotypes, right? Will be the anecdotal experiences of many players having had bad experiences with Mythic Plus only players getting into a Mythic Raiding Guild. The few times they did get into because of their score. They will not really mesh in with the rest of the guild, they will be flaky, they won't show up for raids, especially during farm. They will be more focused on pushing Mythic Plus than pushing the raid. They will put less work, less background work into prepping for the raid because they will be more busy or more interested into doing Mythic Plus. So many players will remember not very fondly the experience of having had high rated Mythic Plus players in their guilds. And again, on this point, it can be very anecdotal, it can change player by player. For example, in our last tier in Erebar Palace, we had 3 different Mythic Plus title level players in our guild, and they did more than fine. That wasn't a problem. However, also in their case, they were also already Mythic Raiders for a while, for a few tiers, so it wasn't a new thing for them to spread their time between Mythic Plus and the raid. So this is more, it's not really a question of can you be a high Mythic Plus pusher while also being a good Mythic Raider. It's rather, why do guilds seem to be less keen on translating the value of a very high rated Mythic Plus player into Mythic Raid if that Mythic Plus player doesn't have the Mythic Raiding experience, doesn't have already current or past experience in Mythic Raiding. That's more of the point. The point that, yes, it's definitely not a minus, not a negative to show that you're good in Mythic Plus when you apply to a raiding guild, but that comes as a plus, right? It comes as an extra. You know, a recruiter would much rather want you to have, for example, even just a 55% average DPS logs in Erebar Palace with casual Mythic Plus score than having 20 to 30% DPS logs in Erebar Palace but having a title from Mythic Plus. And also showing that you quit 4 different guilds in 4 different tiers prior to this expansion, right? So it can be a plus, it can be an extra to show your commitment to the game, your level of skill, even if it's not fully translatable in the raid, but it can't be by itself as good as having Mythic Raid progression, Mythic Raid experience, consistency in being, for example, with the same guild for multiple tiers, knowing already what it means to grind Mythic bosses already, etc, etc. So the point to make was that it's not that there is this massive conspiracy against Mythic Plus players, or rather Mythic Raiders who simply see Mythic Plus as second-class citizens and inferior in all ways. It's rather than there hasn't been too many things that fully translate from Mythic Plus to Mythic Raid, both in terms of performance, both in terms of the things you have to get good at in Mythic Plus, from interrupts, crowd control rotations, random uses of defensives, because you never know when an interrupt is not going to go off. You never know if that mob, that light spawn in Priory is going to be targeting you with his beam of death or not, whereas in Mythic Raiding this kind of damage will be much more scripted, as well as the whole social aspect of being in a larger group of players, having to have a more consistent and committed schedule for multiple months, not just a few weeks of pushing, etc, etc. That's the major difference between the, I guess, what makes you good in Mythic Plus compared to what makes you good in the raid, and why it's not really even close to being a one-to-one translation, and why not often being good in Mythic Plus necessarily translates to also being good in the raid, and why as a result not many raiding guilds will put too much value in having a good Mythic Plus score when it comes to applying to a Mythic Raiding Guild. So, with this cleared out for today on this Wednesday, hoping that it helped a few players still a bit confused by this kind of response they might receive, even as a high-rated Mythic Plus player when it comes to looking to join Mythic Raiding Guilds. For today, on this reset day in EU on this Wednesday, we can now leave each other. We are starting, as usual, the goodbyes by thanking everyone for having watched the video, together with, of course, everyone else who's been supporting completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, this weekend is going to be my aunt's birthday. She is going to be 97 years old. So, congrats to our auntie.